To the Opium Wars. Now, this is a very exciting lesson. The Opium Wars, we'll be learning about a drug that made people very sleepy. And sleep is a very fitting theme from this lesson, as you'll soon discover. Here we go. Here comes our intro music. And I'll skip most of it for copyright reasons. It is Addicted by Dan Steele. No, Dan Seals. Haha. Yes, you'll forgive me if I'm operating off of 3 hours of sleep. Our little baby was born last night, so sleep is at a premium. So we see this political cartoon of a British soldier putting opium down a Chinese man's throat, which definitely, if you've ever had opium put down your throat like that, is really inconsiderate. Now, one of the things you'll note on that bottle is that the opium label is right side up, though the bottle is upside down. So definitely a poorly labeled jar, but of course it's for the viewer. So first off, the question is, what is opium? To understand the importance of the Opium Wars. So it's a drug harvested from a poppy, and you might have heard of the opioid crisis. There are many drugs derived from poppies, from opium, that are much more powerful than opium. So at the time that we're talking about, in the 1800s, opium was typically smoked. But today, when it's synthesized into heroin, it's much more powerful, much more addictive, and much more deadly. But it's not all bad in the world of opium. It can give you powerful painkillers. Perhaps if you've just given birth to a baby and had an operation, maybe opium can be your friend. So now, if you're an opium smoker, the typical addict would use 8 grams per day. And you do a bit of quick opium math here. At $16,000 a kilogram, that comes out to an average of $48,000 a year, which for a lot of people would be like a pretty decent salary. So you can see why a drug addict could go broke pretty quickly and resort to desperate methods. You'll see that little drop of latex syrup in the opium poppy there. That is where you're getting the drug, the medicine from. Okay, so in terms of looking at the drugs here, we see heroin, number 2 on this list of the society-wide harm index of drugs. Alcohol is number 1. So interesting that alcohol is one of the few here that is totally legal, or mostly legal in most parts of the world, but it's used much more widely than heroin, right? You might know a lot of people who have a beer on the weekends, maybe not quite as many who shoot up a little heroin to ride the dragon on the weekends, but very harmful nonetheless. So we've kind of set the stage for the topic at hand. So we've got to talk about empires. Now, if you're going back to ancient empires, well, China, whoosh, it is one of the most longest lasting. It is the longest continually existing empire in the world, or country, if you will. Yeah, you could look at Egypt, but Egypt has been conquered and absorbed into different empires over various periods. Though China has had various dynasties, they've gone from an emperor to a sort of nominal form of democracy in the early 20th century to a communist dictatorship today. It has always been the state of China. You could make an argument about the Mongol Empire, but the Mongol Empire was essentially conquered culturally by the Chinese Empire that they conquered militarily. So in any case, in China, it was expected that if you were visiting the emperor, or if you were visiting an envoy of the emperor, that you would kowtow. So you can see a picture here of a guy kowtowing. I will give you a demonstration of kowtowing, which will really help to drive the point home for you about what exactly this was. So the British, when they came along to China in the 1800s, they were the most powerful empire in the world. We already looked at how they did this in the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, they had lost the United States with the American Revolution, but since then they'd only enriched themselves more by expanding in India and industrializing. So when the British showed up to China to trade, and the Chinese said, hey, kowtow to our emperor, the British said, no way, Jose, we are not doing that. Like, if anything, we'd only do that to our own king or queen. So we are setting up a clash of arrogant empire versus arrogant empire. And you have to be grateful that I don't appear on camera in this video, because I am a shadow of myself, living in filth in the hospital. It's terrible. So not only do I live in filth currently, but also opium addicts also found themselves living in filth. The question is, how did we get to this point where there were a lot of addicts to opium? Okay, so Britain wanted a lot of Chinese stuff. Tea, silk, porcelain. So porcelain, we might think today, what's the big deal? I've got porcelain in my toilet, and I have like 3 toilets at home, one of which even works. Porcelain at this point was really prized for valuable plates, dishes, vases, things we see there in the picture. And now porcelain, only China actually had a working recipe for porcelain, which is what made it so rare. Eventually in the 20th century, the Germans figured that out because the Germans were known for all kinds of acts of humanitarianism in the Oh wait, never mind. Maybe wrong century. Okay, but they did figure out porcelain. Germans hadn't figured out porcelain in the 1800s yet. So China was your go-to. So now the problem was that China didn't really want anything Britain had. What did Britain have? Well, they had wool. They had wool sweaters. And the Chinese said, well, we've got silk. That's better than wool, and we can have our own wool. We're a big country. So now Britain found themselves losing money. So this was for a couple of reasons, partly that the Chinese didn't want to buy stuff from them, and also that the Chinese did their business in silver. Did their like commerce. I'm not talking about, number 1, number 2. The British used gold. So the British were finding that they were starting to run out of silver. They were having to buy silver from other places in order to buy products from China. This was making trade more and more expensive. So they had to figure out how could they change this balance of trade. There are currently questions about that if we look at with tariffs in our modern world today. But the British had a different answer to that question. And it was creating demand for drugs. Yes, we see a picture of an opium den here. So if you were to look up a future employee on Facebook or Google or something like that, and you saw him right in the middle of this picture, you might think this guy's not really a reliable worker. Not at all. And that is exactly what happened to the Chinese workforce. So Britain, as we can see in the 1700s, they already were shipping opium to China. By the 1800s, early 1800s, shipping 40,000 chests per year. They were basically creating demand by getting people addicted. So suddenly, the balance of trade had reversed, and silver was leaving China, going to Britain, and the problems, social problems of drug addiction were becoming prevalent. That the workforce was basically becoming unreliable because they were stoned. So Commissioner Lin Jeju, who is pretty much the emperor's right-hand man at this point, he said, we've got to do something about this. So they took the Chinese Navy and seized these British opium shipments. You might wonder, where was this opium coming from? It was actually really convenient that Britain had an empire in India, because India, being a bit warmer, a lot warmer, was an ideal climate for growing opium. Afghanistan actually for a long time was the number 1 producer of opium in modern times, but the Taliban destroyed the opium crop in recent years. So Myanmar, which is a neighbor of India, they are now number 1 for opium sales. So anyway, Commissioner Lin, though, back in the 1800s, destroyed these British opium shipments. So as you can imagine, I'm sure the British will say, hey, you know what, we had it coming, right? And so if you're familiar with geography, India is a lot closer to China than Britain, so to sell the opium from India to China didn't really take that much distance. Okay. The empire strikes back. Da, 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 da. You'll excuse my beautiful singing voice. Please try not to be too jealous. So the British Indian Army arrived, as well as the British Navy. The British Navy deserves a lot of credit here. They were Britain's real backbone of their military force. They seized cities, destroyed the Chinese Navy. If you look at the casualty counts of some of these battles from Wikipedia, a few dozen British soldiers died, thousands of Chinese soldiers died. And so to jump ahead to why did China lose, it goes to military technology. Yes, the Chinese had invented gunpowder, but they hadn't developed it in a military application nearly to the degree that the British had. They had been constantly fighting these other European powers and the Americans, so there was this constant need to refine and improve these guns. China, a few years later, was forced to sign a peace treaty in which, humiliatingly, which I'm sure that's a word, they gave the British extraterritoriality. And this was so awful for them because it meant that the British were allowed to follow their own laws on Chinese territory. For example, following their law that it's okay to sell opium. And this is exactly what happened. The British were allowed to continue selling opium, and the Chinese lost a bunch of pockets of land, several pockets of land. So this was an attempt to resist imperialism, and it failed miserably. It really shows that it was, at this time, an irresistible force. So here shows some of the destruction, the remains of the Summer Palace in Beijing. We can still see in modern times, compared to an old painting of the glory that it once enamored. Sorry, not enamored, embodied. Yes, my apologies for that. You'll forgive me, I hope. And if not, well, you can live in bitterness. Okay, so where does this fit in with the pattern of historical globalization? So China didn't need globalization. They were self-sufficient. It was a huge country. They produced everything they needed. They had a diverse economy. They had been politically autonomous, meaning no one controlled them. So the British said, well, we're going to put an end to that. We're going to make you dependent on our drugs, and we're going to take away the legitimacy, the strength of your government with military force. This did cause the Qing dynasty to have a lot of instability in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Eventually, there was a boy king. It was the Dowager Empress, the last 2 years, who ruled China up until 1911, when their monarchy was overthrown, the last dynasty of China. So we saw Ethiopia in the scramble for Africa was a notable exception of resisting imperialism, although we'll see that the resistance wouldn't last forever, successfully anyway. But China was a dramatic example. If we look at what happened to Japan, Japan embraced Eurocentrism and imperialism very much because they saw that China had tried to resist it and failed. So I have a bit of a graphic designer here for you. Graphic designer, no. That's not what I mean at all. I mean, I have a graphic diagram for you. Looking at some of these key concepts of mercantilism, capitalism, industrialization, colonization, and imperialism. So we see that mercantilism was this old school accumulation of wealth, getting taxes, getting trade, conquering people if you could. It took many forms, but it was government-led. Eventually, the criticisms of this, if we're going to the right, were criticized by people such as Adam Smith, and said it's more efficient for individuals to control wealth. We see that mercantilism, if we're going to the left, encouraged colonization. If we look at the colonization of Canada, the plantations of the United States, very mercantilist, very government-directed economic activity. Jumping down to the bottom, industrialization. Well, capitalism really encouraged the creativity, the innovation to develop factory-based production. And yet this factory-based production, like mercantilism in its own way, would lead to more colonization, especially the scramble for Africa, this struggle for resources and materials. And much of this can fall under imperialism. So any society controlling another one, whether that's through military or economic force, whether it's through colonization, or whether it's through straight up conquering them and just imposing your will, but not necessarily sending your people to go live there. So if you look at Germany in World War II, conquering France, that would be like an example of imperialism. That's not colonization. It's kind of like how every falcon is a hawk, but not every hawk is a falcon. Okay, I hope that makes a lot of sense. Truly. So I want you to find an example of how these concepts of imperialism and colonialism affected a country in what today we call the global south. So you may pick a country from Asia, Africa, or South America, that was colonized, especially with a focus on the 1800s, and to look at what was the impact of that colonialism. You're looking for three things. What was the colonizers' motive? Were they in it for example, coconut oil or ivory or rubber? What was the colony's suffering? If you look at Africa with the Democratic Republic of Congo, which we'll look at later, people were murdered if they did not fulfill quotas. So perhaps other people were starved because of the colony becoming impoverished. Maybe disease was spread. Maybe they were entangled in the wars of the mother country. You're going to need to do some research to find out. And lastly, what is the lasting impact today? So many of these countries are now independent, but whether we look at their culture, is the language they speak the language of their colonizer? Is their economy still dependent on their old mother country, so to speak? I want you to look at that kind of impact. So it shouldn't take a ton of research. You can pick your adopted country. You can pick a different one. But I want you to come up with a political cartoon that tells the reader these things. Please don't go looking for historical political cartoons because people are often tempted to plagiarize. And plagiarism, it's definitely a big old zero. You don't have to be like the super cleverest or wittiest cartoon ever, as long as you get your point across. You can have a few different panels in your cartoon if you feel that that suits your purpose. You will also have 2 blocks, the rest of this one and all of next block, to complete this. If you have any questions at all, please ask your friendly neighborhood teacher, whether that's me or someone else, to answer them for you. Now have a wonderful day and get lots of sleep. Bye-bye now.